latest advances and information on different irrigation and farm system. First up, we have Damian Jones. Now, Damian is the Trials Manager with Irrigated Cropping Council. He has a rich history with the department, private consulting and with ICC. He brings extensive knowledge about crop, agronomy and also irrigated research. I've spoken to this bloke about 5 times on podcasts and never met him yesterday. Didn't realise how incredibly handsome he is. You're all about to find out that now, if you hadn't already met him. Damian Jones.
Thanks, Neil. Rightio. So yes, I've been asked to give a rundown of the Optimising Irrigated Grains project. Now, I didn't want to just come up here and start presenting a heap of data about what you should be doing for your canola, sowing rates, all that sort of stuff. One of the things that's going to come out of the project is a good management guide, and so that's going to contain all the data. So I thought for my presentation, I'd rather sort of discuss some of the things as part of the 3 years of the project that have sort of occurred to me that give us either irrigation a unique sort of agronomic aspects, and also some of the learnings, that what makes irrigation different to dryland. So I've titled it Reflections of the Project rather than Here's a Heap of Data. The working title was Ruminations on the project, and I was just going to put that word in there to keep the livestock guys happy. So, moving right along. Whoops. Okay, so Optimising Irrigated Grains project. 3-year GRDC project, looking at quite a number of factors of irrigated grains. So it was sort of 4 sub-projects. One was the trials program, and that was coordinated by FAR Australia, and FAR Australia and ourselves did a majority of the trial work. The next aspect was the irrigated discussion groups, and that's where each of those farming system groups below there, each had the opportunity to run discussion groups, obviously, and also the potential to run some focus paddocks and actually test out some of the things either that were being coming out of the trials program or talk to their own growers and see what they wanted to see done. Now, it was more sort of demonstration type stuff more than trial stuff, but some of the groups did go down that trials path. And the third one was some economics. It's all right saying in a year like this where we've got heaps of water, yes, we can go for maximising yield, but there's those decisions to be made in years where we haven't got as much water. Do we actually try and push yield along, or do we tone back and concentrate more on that return per megalitre? And the fourth part was a little bit of amelioration. A lot of interest in subsoil, improving our subsoils. So there's 2 sites, one at Noorong in southern New South Wales and one over at Finley, where we were looking at putting organic matter down deep rips to try and keep the rips alive, if you like, in terms of improving soil structure. So that was sort of the 4th component of the project. So my reflections, ruminations will be principally on the trials aspect of it. So I sort of picked out 5 key areas that I thought. The fertility of our system is so much different to a lot of dry land. We did a lot of work on nitrogen. If we get the fertility right, the nitrogen right, and all the other aspects right, we've still got to get our irrigation right to make sure we maintain our yield. Faba beans have been an interesting crop. I still, even after this project, I still don't think we've got a full understanding of why faba beans do what they do. And also, an interesting part of the project has been the modelling, partly in an attempt to see, what are we doing right, or what, and I'll show you some data, what we possibly could be changing. But before we leap into the swallowing the modelling scenarios, I think we need to do a little bit more agronomic testing. And yeah, if you look at those topics, they're just sort of where I've started with the thing. In some ways, they're interrelated, so there's a fair bit of inter-valley trade between each of those topics. Right, so for fertility, One of the things that GRDC asked us to do when we were coming to the end of the project is, what's the way forward? So what Nick Poole did as Director of FAR Australia was to summarise what we found in the OIG project, but also what aspects we potentially could look forward and investigate a bit further down the track. So, and the key statement I took out of his proposal was that the previous crop histories and nutritional starting points can have a greater impact than the subsequent management. So what we do with our soil, with our stubbles, with our previous management of the crop can actually have a far bigger impact on what we end up with in this season. So what we did last season can have more an effect on this season than what we can fix with this season. And that's in particularly nitrogen management. And it's a consistent theme where we're trying to push yield along. So with us in the OIG and with the hyper-yielding crops project is that we can push yields up, but we do have a big demand for nutrients, and particularly with nitrogen, we can struggle with trying to get that level of nutrition in with artificial inputs. We have to start with a fertile system to be in the game. So if we look back at our trials, particularly at Kerrang, because I've got sort of more day-to-day management in those versus the Finley trials, is that we're consistently seeing in excess of 100 kilos of N per hectare being generated by our fertility in our soils. So that's independent of the fertiliser we're putting on. That's what our soils are giving us. And we have measured up to 180 kilos of N being supplied by the system rather than us putting it on. So it's a quite considerable amount of nitrogen that we're seeing generated by our soils, by our fertility, inherent fertility that we've got. And I suppose this was really highlighted when we had an early field walk, we were looking at maize, that the question was asked, well, how do you work out your nitrogen budgets? And the question about, well, what level of or assumptions of nitrogen inputs when you're carrying out a nitrogen budget, what level of nitrogen do you account for or anticipate? And it was generally, wasn't rated very high, through to I don't do it at all, through to, there's probably 50 units or something. So there wasn't, to me, it wasn't a great understanding of how much we could potentially get. Now that 180 was a greenfield site, so it hadn't grown corn before, but it was quite surprising to see that much nitrogen actually offered up by the soil, if you like. Now that level of soil fertility does come at a cost. Obviously the microbes are breaking down our soil organic matter to release that level of nitrogen. So we're assuming that soil organic matter has about 10% N, so if we get 100 kilos of N mineralised, that means the soil microbes have chewed through about a tonne of soil organic matter. So we have to put that back. Where we get into trouble is if we're not putting it back and we continually rely on the soil to supply the crop, then we start to erode our soil organic matter. Now, this is the part where I say, do what I say, not what I do, because if we look at the trial block at Kerrang, we've been continuously cropping there for just over 20 years. We're not the best stubble retention proponents due to the limitations of our trials equipment. So we've actually chewed through about 5 tonne of organic carbon over that period. So we're losing our fertility as we're putting our crops in. So we need to replace that soil nitrogen and that soil organic matter. And soil organic matter isn't just made up of nitrogen, it's also the phosphorus, potassium, calcium. So there's lots of other nutrients as well. And as we've seen in a couple of projects, and I'll go off onto a tangent in the next slide, that once we lose our soil organic carbon, soil organic matter, it is difficult and expensive to get back. And so I've called these tangents because they're not really part of the OIG project, but are just a couple of ideas to sort of explain where I'm coming from. So this is a demonstration that we did with Beyond Soil Care with Golden Broken CMA, and it was looking at a maize crop. So we put out 10 tonne of organic matter, resembling stubble, so high carbon, low nitrogen. And then we just tried different scenarios. You know, do we incorporate that material? Do we add fertiliser? And if you've heard me talk about organic carbon before, it's the Clive Kirkby model where we want to compost our stubble residues rather than just let them slowly burn as standing stubble. So what we found is that, yes, you put out 10 tonne of organic matter, you get an increase in the soil organic carbon, and this is a demo, so don't get too hung up on the points because we've got one that goes for a fairly wild ride. But we started at this point, about 1.65% organic carbon. We saw some plots increase, some decrease, but what we saw is a general increase after we had faba beans. Then after the faba beans, we had a general run down, and I thought we were heading back to where we started from, but we put faba beans in again and we finally got a bit of an uplift. So the legumes do play a vital part in maintaining our fertility. Righto, so the other aspect of it, and this does relate to fertility as well, is once again we do start with a higher soil N at sowing compared to dry land, and this was highlighted 12 months ago where I managed to avoid having to do a presentation here, and I did one down at Bort. They were interested in what we were finding in the the irrigated canola. So I went through my scenario. Yeah, we only put out 120 units of N, blah, blah, blah. You know, we're growing 4 tonnes. And then I was followed quick by the Incitec Pivot guy, who then proceeded to talk about an example from the Mallee where they had 11 kilos of N, starting soil N. And so they were putting out roughly about the same amount of N to drive a sort of, 2 to 2.5 tonne yield where we were trying to get 4. So it really highlighted to me that, we're really in a different system, that it relates back that we have far better inherent fertility, hopefully, in our system. The other aspect that we've also noticed with irrigation is that because we've been able to put moisture into the, later into the season, and the crops have got readily available moisture, not rapidly diminishing moisture like potentially in dry land, that we are able to get the nitrogen into the crop for longer. So we're requiring more, but we also have a greater window of opportunity to get nitrogen into the crop to grow more crop. So that sort of highlights that we can get better nitrogen use efficiency from our crops. So if we're doing a nitrogen budget, dry landers are probably looking at, it takes about 80 kilos of N per tonne to grow a tonne of canola. Whereas our trials at Kerrang were showing that we consistently only need 60 kilos of N per tonne to grow a tonne of canola. So sort of going along with that, and this question came up at our field day last year where Nick said, well, we've been doing this for 2 years, how much nitrogen is Damo putting out on to maximise yield? And no one knew, so I thought I'd better put this in a slide. So this is typically what we're doing to get, I'm calling it a plateau of the yield because obviously we're getting some differences in, say, the durums where we want to push protein rather than just yield. But so this is typically what we're getting, the amount of nitrogen we're using to sort of flatten out the yield. And these have been generated by trials where we're going, say, from 0, 40, 80, etc., up to ridiculously high figures, just to see where we can push yield to. And as you can see there, to get 8 tonne of barley, we're really starting to top out our yield at 80 kilos of N applied. And if we want to push it into a bit higher protein to get it into malting, then we're having to use about 120 kilos of N. For 4 tonne of canola, year in, year out, it's about 120. Sometimes it's up to 160, but obviously that reflects the different starting ends we get from where the canola's going in after, in terms of the rotation. For the durums, we actually maximise yield out, and so probably bread wheat too, around about that 100 to 150 kilos of N applied, but obviously with durums, we want to push that protein, so we are having to put more nitrogen on to gain that DR1 13% protein. And for maize, and this has been the interesting one, that we've consistently, and this was 3 years of trial work, we ended up with exactly the same scenario, that we're seeing a plateauing of the yield with 240 kilos of N. And that's also been found at the Finley site, and the Far site, which was up near Rutherglen. That was corn on corn on corn, and they were seeing no real improvement to that sort of 240, 250 kilos of N. So if we look at the nitrogen use efficiency of the crops, barley's we're getting about 30 kilos, we're requiring 30 kilos of N per tonne. Canola's 60. Durums, to get DR1 with a good starting nitrogen, about 50 kilos of N per tonne. And for the maize, it's around about 20 to 25 kilos per tonne of grain. So when do we put our nitrogen out? Canola didn't seem to really matter. You could put it a lot. So the nitrogen use efficiency project with this was effectively splitting our nitrogen into 2 applications. And we had sort of, for canola, it was at sowing or six leaf or green bud or yellow bud. And really, you'd be hard-pressed to say which was the best. So looking over all of the trials that we did, so preference for canola is 6 leaf to that green bud stage. Durums was later, simply because we're trying to push protein, and we seem to get more protein efficiency, for want of a better word, by putting on that GS39 full flag emergence timing. And maize, our trials, it was a little bit variable. 1 year it was the all up front gave us the best yield. The next year it was splits from sowing through to tasseling. So once again, there was really no standout application timing. So my take on it was, as long as you get adequate nitrogen out, and that might be less than you think it is, just make sure you get your nitrogen and get your water right for the maize. Which leads me to get the water right, because we can get all this, get the perfect population, the perfect nitrogen strategy, perfect everything else. And if we bugger it up by not watering on time, then it's all that effort's out the window, all that money's out the window. So we rely on G-bugs, so it's old technology, but at least we've got something there to tell us when the crop is starting to run out of moisture. We have had some assistance from Rubicon to put some gear in, but the more modern type stuff, you've got to calibrate it for your site, for your soil type, to make sure you get the best value out of it. So I would recommend that it's not about buying whatever gear, it's about what after-sales service and advice you get. One of the other aspects we were investigating was sort of irrigation via sprinkler and irrigation via good old flood. Now, what we ran into in 2 years, and surprisingly it wasn't 2022, but in winter of 20 and 21, with our sprinkler trials, we really ran into a problem where we can't get water from May 15 to August 15. So our crops actually ran out of moisture in that sort of late July, early August period. So we're sitting there waiting for the water to come back on, and meanwhile the crops are sitting there just saying, nah, that's it. We're moisture stressed, we're not growing. And this was really apparent in the faba beans and the canola. So that sort of brings into that, do we need pre-irrigation? And my gut feel is in the west, yes. In the east, not so much. But that was one of the things that, we've got to make a decision on when we're deciding whether we're going to pre-irrigate or not. And I'll just throw away line at the bottom is about that we don't necessarily waterlog. There was, I had a bit of a discussion with a canola expert, because one of the most common questions I get in spring is, it's drying out, my canola's flowering, should I irrigate it? Because generally we don't want to stress the plants when they're flowering. My usual reply is it's better to have 1 day's waterlogging than 14 days drought, so water it. Now, that copped a bit of a spray from me, from a canola expert who said, oh, waterlogging, terrible, can't have waterlogging. And I got about 50,000 papers shown to me about this, how evil waterlogging is on canola. But the one that stood out was, yes, it caused all these stresses, and oh, look at these stress hormones in the plant, and oh, made no difference to yield. So, and I think with our improved layouts, we're not getting the waterlogging we used to get. When we get waterlogging, it's not from irrigation, it's from possibly irrigation filling up the profile, but it's rainfall that gives us the waterlogging. Faba beans, my favourite crop. So I'll give you some data. Yes, we need 18 plants per square metre minimum, but the interesting thing was through the Finley trials was that we hadn't seen the yield plateau, and they're going as high as 48 plants per square metre, which is equivalent to a sowing rate about 300 kilograms per hectare, depending on seed size, of course. The other thing is that we were getting pretty close to 20 tonnes of dry matter at the Kerrang trials, but given that we've had trials previously where we grow a lot smaller crop and we can get harvest index of about 0.5, which means we grow 10 tonne or 20 tonne of dry matter and we can get 10 tonne of grain, we're only getting 6 to 7 tonnes. So we're not getting the harvest index that we possibly could. And another just quick observation before I go off onto a tangent is we really didn't see any increase in disease from using overheads. It's a transition, we put water out via an overhead, it's only wet for a couple of hours. Rainfall is the killer in terms of encouraging disease. So I was asked about using summer legumes to actually increase our nitrogen supply in our plants, in our system. So this year we've got lots of water. Is it worthwhile actually trying to grow a legume to improve our soil fertility, build up our soil nitrogen? So the most successful crop we've had is Lab as a legume over summer. A lot of the others aren't particularly legume-like. They don't seem to fix a lot of N. So if it costs us about 6 megalitres of water, I'm working on an assumption of 20 kilos of N per tonne of dry matter, which Graham may disagree, or he's agreeing with me. Good. Thank goodness for that. So if we price water at $60 a meg, the 200 kilos of N that we potentially could grow is going to cost us $3.35 a kilo to grow. Now, and that is an equivalent price of urea at $1,540 a tonne. Now, I then tried to reverse it. Well, how cheap can I get the water till I can break even with the urea price? So I was quoted $7.50 a tonne for summer, which is $1.63 per kilo of N. Unfortunately, the establishment cost of alone of the crop chewed up all my potential income from that nitrogen. So I'm going to get, what's that, roughly $320 worth of nitrogen, and it's going to cost me about $320 to establish my lab without any water. So I wouldn't do it as an economic activity. The next bit is modelling, and I'm going to zoom through this, Neil, I promise. So University of Tasmania did this for us. I have to admit up front, I'm not sold on modelling, but it did throw up some interesting scenarios. So the first thing we asked it to do, particularly with the broadleaf crops, that we've got a pretty good understanding of where we are with our wheat, what is our yield potential? And for Kerrang, sort of west, it's about 9 tonne year in, year out. We could possibly get up to 12 tonne in a really sunny, dry year with irrigation. So we asked it to do some of the broadleaf crops. So chickpeas, 5.8 tonnes, canola 6.3, durum's 9.1, barley 10.6, faba beans 11.5, maize 21.6. Now, the thing that stood out for me was maize at 21.6, yet every time I hear about maize, it's, they get 38 tonnes in the US. What magic potion do we need to get to 38 tonnes? But the modelling is saying if we can grow 20, we're getting pretty damn close to what our environment will allow. But the killer one was favour beans, 11.5. Who's got 11.5 tonnes of favour beans before?
Off the whole paddock.
Right, so I'll get rid of that. So, well, actually, no, I won't, because, so what I'm doing here is trying to get, and I've just said, grow pulses because we want them to put nitrogen in the system. So at the moment, this is our scenario. We're getting about 6 tonne of beans from 18 tonne of biomass. So we're producing about 360 kilos of N from our favour bean crop. We're exporting about 200 kilos of N as our beans, which leaves about 160 kilos left. And that's about what we're seeing. We'll soil test in midwinter and we'll see somewhere between 140 and 160 after our favour beans. But if we push these to 11 from 20 tonnes of biomass, means so if you do the sums, we're potentially about 110 kilos of N short, assuming that our stubble still has 160 kilos. It's a bit confusing, but it means if we're pushing these to 11 tonnes, are our favour beans still going to be a legume or are they going to require nitrogen top dressing? So that's just an aside. The modelling, this is where it starts to get, from a research point of view, interesting. Wheat, we seem to be getting our wheat flowering dates right, so that's about 1st of October, and we've had several projects that say first week of October is our wheat flowering date target. But if I zoom down here to, if I go with that, right, so this is favour beans. So I've used late variety just because consistency with the previous table. What it's saying is our flowering period should be, what's that? 20th of May, 21st of May, through to 1st of July. Now, who has favour beans that do that? We'll probably do that next year. And maize. Maize's preferred flowering date to get that 22 tonne is 1st of March. And there's a comment in the notes is that obviously the model doesn't have to harvest these crops. So that's just some food for thought. I can understand this. This is the maize wants to avoid heat stress when we're flowering, and it's usually 40 degrees when that happens. This is fine. I don't know why the model wants us to be there. So the optimising irrigated grains gave us a great opportunity to revisit some of the work that we've done previously. One of the great things about the opportunity was to look at why we're getting the results we are. Rather than just put nitrogen out and say, oh yes, here, we would be able to look at populations, we could look at biomass we were accumulating, we look at harvest index, all that sort of thing. Nitrogen intake was super critical to understanding how much nitrogen we need for the system. And it was good to look at, how much does soil N contribute to that. And the Optimising Irrigated Grains Good Management Guide will have all the facts and figures that you'll need to know, and that's in its last stages of editing. So everyone stay tuned for that. Thank you.
You should see the looks I'm getting whenever someone's up on here. This is not about me, it's about Melinda. Anyone who knows Melinda will know you don't step over the line and let the program run late, otherwise this is not worth our life.
But this is a usual presenter's. The good way to do a presentation is you run into your question time so you don't have any questions to answer.
That's it, absolutely. We could record a podcast. This is just like being at home, isn't it? So, is there any questions for Damian before we go on to our next presentation? We've got a couple of minutes. He only took 3/4 of the question time. There's a young man down here in the front row who we gave him half an hour and he still wants more time. Dale.
Dale Gray, Agvic Bendigo. Jonesy, those massive big favour bean crops, do you have any evidence that you grow your cheapest in terms of inputs or maximise yield after them? Like, is there any anecdotal evidence that your trial work does particularly well after those big favours or not?
I'm happy to anyone else to offer up thing, but no. You see a range of crops through, that are probably approaching 18, 20 tonne through to, the one that surprised me the most was it was about knee high the cooperator told us that when it was going about 4 tonnes, and I'm looking at it going, oh, yeah. And it went 4.2 when we actually did the harvesting. So there's some big variety there. You know, we've gone down the path of sowing earlier, which only seemed to encourage vegetation and lodging. So I'm not, as I said, I'm not 100% sure where we're going to go, but I don't think our crops are out of the ordinary on the trial block. I hope I'm answering your question.
But the wheat after those big favours,
Oh, the wheat.
is that maximising out more often and easilier? It's terrible English.
I think it gives us a good platform, but there is a danger. And so high soil N is easier to manage with canola than wheat. We've got that danger of going back to the bad old days where we used to pre-drill a lot of urea and create a huge bulky canopy that Martin Stapper proved that was totally useless. It just wasted nitrogen. So we went to this more measured approach early and then give it when the crop needs it, rather than creating this huge excess biomass. So it can create more problems, and Graham's probably got a comment.
Yeah, I was thinking that to specifically answer Dale's question, what we probably have to do is compare the farming systems data at Grenfell, Wagga and Lockhart. You've got favour beans with different biomass. They're fully sequenced, been running for a long time, been in a cropping phase. That would tease out that question a bit. But growers do manage it exactly how you've articulated. You know, they prefer to come in with canola on the back of a big legume crop, for sure. But Rowan might have more to say.
If he ever gets an opportunity.
Yeah. Damian, thank you for your insights today and for keeping within the time limit. That's very kind of you. And we've all learned a new word from Dale. Easily